because my interest is very much in this or his or her relationship to architecture, and of course it's a very old image. It's Walter Pichler in the 60s already, and it's one of the first attempts of augmented reality, but that's not why I chose it. It's more or less because I would like to go back to, in a way, the basics of architecture, to find out if at this point when we use the computer as a design tool, we do not have to come up with a new definition of what architecture and what form in general is, because if you look around and if you see definitions that are around, they are very, very traditional, and they are sometimes a lot of probably 80% of architectural theoretical work is still referring back to even Vitruve and so, things like that. So I'm interested in this as an object, and try to add to the frustrations that Freud, these three famous frustrations that he said that modern man had to undergo. And it's an object, of course, with perception. And perception is intrinsically restless, as we know, so this thing is constantly moving in a way. And at the same time, it's a bit different than other things or objects because it's an autopoietic system. It means it reproduces everything that it needs by itself, so it takes things in, but all the cells in our body, they are reproduced by ourselves. The second element that we are dealing with in architecture is these objects, that very, very simply we could call them wall, or let's call them thing. And there's been this big discussion about a new definition of what an object is, and you all know Latour and these people and Harman and Latour mainly, who says that these things are also actors in a way. We can't really keep up with this simple definition that these things are kind of dumb elements that are just standing in our way, but they have a certain influence and they participate in interactions. That's Bruce Nauman, by the way, in this green corridor. I don't show the green, but you show, what I'm interested in is exactly this relationship between these two objects. And these things, as we know, I always choose the very, very simple ones because we know this can have all kinds of articulations. It can move itself already. And these experiments that they do, mainly in London, even at the AA, they build these kind of fantastic facades that are moving. But I'm interested in the wall as a dividing element, as a thing. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of walls around in architecture recently, so it's really kind of a revival, being discrete and dividing up territory and kind of separations and boundaries, and not only in reality, which is a very negative and sad effect. There's walls going up everywhere. We know fences and walls and with terrible consequences, but I still believe that walls also have a positive effect, and that they are in a way very, very central to architecture in general. So that's Kersten Gers, Diamond Severin office, Belgian office, and you also know probably this guy, Aureli, with his stop city in kind of opposition to the no stop city of Archisum. But what is lacking, I think, as a sociologist and as a human being, is this situation, because that's exactly what we are facing. We have this kind of very strange, complex environment divided by a very thin thing from something else going on outside. So how could we, in a way, very simple, as I say, very basic, redefine this? And as being a sociologist, I was trained in all these kind of sociological theories, and one of the most, or for me, the most spatial sociological theory is network theory. And you also know that, for example, Bruno Latour uses exactly this network theory for his actor network theory to bring together objects and what we could still call individuals. And what is interesting about these networks is, as I say, they immediately suggest more or less that this could be groups of individuals who are linked in a certain way. And we all know that these links are, of course, more and more mediatized in the present, but I think it's still very important, and that's why we're here. It's still very important that we also put ourselves in a spatial position against each other. And what is interesting about this, one of the most interesting, I think, insights of this social network theory is the theory of structural holes or weak links. That is, like, this is kind of a group that all of you know, your peers, your friends, you know each other very well, and they have very strong ties amongst each other, or families are classical social systems that have these. But then there's these links where one person here knows somebody somewhere else, and only occasionally meets him or her. And these are very important, that's why I wrote this down. The strength of a tie, there's a general definition of what a tie is between these, is a probably linear combination of the amount of time, the emotional intensity, the intimacy, mutual confiding, and the reciprocal services which characterize a tie. But what's interesting is weak ties provide people with access to information and resources beyond those available in their own social circle, but strong ties have greater motivation and so on. So strong ties are good for trust, are good for making decisions in a certain context. But if you really need new information and innovation, we are relying on these weak ties. There's sociological research that if you think about yourself, if you get some really interesting new information about a new job or a new apartment, a flat, usually or very often it happens through these weak ties. So that's why they're very important. As I said, in a very crude way, this could be almost transferred to social situations. As I said, you know, these things like this could be us, you know, we're moving around, we are in this space, and then there's these weak ties, and then this is another animation I did because, of course, there's always these strange spaces around us, because I would say that this is a form in itself. It's almost, for me, a proto-architectural form, you know, a spatial arrangement to foster social interaction. Sorry that this, oh no, it's over. So, societies in general are, and that's kind of in a way a development that has been taking place for a long time, are no longer that much interested in the individual as I say, as an object or even as a personality, but in the communication that happens between them. They say that communication is more or less the driving force, or is kind of everything that makes a society. And communication, of course, as we know, is an operation. So we don't need this kind of sociological theories. They're not interested in the individuals anymore or in these networks, but they're interested only in these processes of exchange of information between individuals. Communication, again, requires form generation for two reasons: as a precondition for the participation of discrete communicative objects and as a guarantee for connectivity. Connectivity, Anschlussfähigkeit in German, is a term coined mainly by Niklas Luhmann, which is a very famous German sociologist, social system theorist. And it means that autopoietic systems, and communication is also an autopoietic system, is based on continually connecting cooperation to operation. That's what we know from life. You know, if you are alive, there's obviously certain processes in your body that are continually connecting to each other. Once these processes stop, you're dead, you're a corpse, and then the object is still there, but the kind of life has gone. And communication is the same. So as long as communication continues, a society or a social group exists, the communication breakdown doesn't exist anymore. On the other way, as I said, bodies are the kind of carriers of perception, and communication is depending on perception. So perception operates with formless distinctions, so it operates on a level below that is required for communication, and because communication has to pass on information and therefore has to give its distinctions form, that means perceptual forms, or these formless distinctions of perception have to be transformed into formed distinctions that are used in communication. That's not very easy to understand, but I try to show an example later which makes it more easy. And that's basically a theory, this kind of theory of that the form is not, in a traditional way, as it always has been, a compilation of elements or a certain connection of elements, a nexus of elements, but there was a British mathematician called Spencer Brown who said, a form is a distinction. Yeah? And this quote from him again, we take as given the idea of distinction and the idea of indication, and then we cannot make an indication without drawing a distinction. We take, therefore, the form of the distinction for the form. It's a very abstract definition. He says, as soon as you make a line on a paper, you make a distinction between two sides, but still then it's a symmetrical thing. So if you really want to make a distinction, you need this kind of marker, you need this indicator, and then you suddenly have one side. And this kind of very interesting concept of what a form is, such a distinction plus an indication, has been taken, for example, by people as Luhmann to develop a theory of form that is completely different from the theories I think most of you are using. It would be interesting to ask, you know, what your definition of form is. Usually, as I say, it's an ordering, it's an arrangement of elements in a certain way. And that's why forms must be articulated asymmetrically, since only one of their sides, the internal side, but not the other external side, is needed for further operations. So a very simple example that even Spencer Brown gives and that everybody of you will understand is if you have dirty dishes and clean dishes, You go there, you make a very clear decision, I go to the dirty dishes, but then the next operation, of course, has to connect on this side of your distinction. That doesn't make sense then suddenly go back to the clean dishes, but you continue once you make this decision and you indicated the dirty dishes as dirty dishes, and you continue on this dirty dishes side. It's a very, very simplified explanation. It's needed for further operations, elaborations, increases in complexity, and so on. Forms are generated by a rupture of symmetry, which might be interesting for Hilbersheimer, which must be presupposed or posited as something that simply happened. So then there is one definition of form, and then there's another very interesting definition of form, and that's also something that I take from Luhmann, that says a form is derived or can be derived from a medium, and in case of space, the medium would be space, and the form would be an object. And a medium is always made of loosely coupled elements. In this kind, in this place, in this concept, using it on space, it's places. In original, he calls it Stellen. It's one of these words that's very difficult to translate into English. And distinctions in space create objects by tightly coupling such places. So that's another interesting definition of what form is. So in space, form is an object, and generally for communication, form is a distinction and an indication. So that means if you would think about these kind of ties, as we've seen in the social network, which could of course be also ties in Facebook and in all kind of mediated communication, but if you think about spatial communication, then we could have something like distant links and close links, like we've seen, people being closer together, being further apart from each other. And I would say this is such a form. It makes a distinction out of all the possibilities to connect to somebody, and it has a certain space between these people that is kept constant at a certain level. So as I say, it's a very, very basic definition. There's an interesting illustration of that by Pablo Reynosa, an artist. We can see, we can imagine that these kind of spaces exist in reality, and we know that they exist. And as I say, it's again abstracting and bringing down everything that we think about to a very, very basic level. That means we have this kind of, as I call them, distance circles. For example, these people, they want to stay in a certain availability, but they keep a certain distance that we know. For example, if we go somewhere and this kind of very equal distribution of people when they go to a public swimming pool, interestingly enough, without any kind of rules or regulations, they keep the same distance between themselves because they want somebody to be in a way not too far away if they need him for kind of supervision or whatever. At the same time, they don't want to really communicate, so they keep this distance. This kind of distance is broken, of course, if you have a close connection, a close link, then these kind of elements come closer together. So we have this one form of kind of spatial behavior in a way that has two different variations, because of course in this case there is not really communication possible or happening, it's just an availability, and in this case communication actually happens. So the process is oscillating between these two states. And we have this other one. We have the possibility to not keep a distance from somebody, but to simply put something between us and then kind of have the same effect of, in this case, then accessibility, because usually these things have doors. And it's a bad example because, again, it's a negative example of what walls can be. And it's a kind of absurd example, but I have to look for a better one. And as I say, it will become clearer when I show something else, not because these unfortunately are very, very abstract. Yeah. So if we have this kind of distance relationship and then place an object in between, of course, immediately these elements can come closer together, these two objects that are, in our case, individuals, and they still maintain this kind of link, but it's a completely different link. And if you think about it, of course, these are, and I can't really show this because these are constantly moving. Usually they are kind of not stable unless they are for a while sitting somewhere. But this is then a really sedentary position. We know this when the first cities arrive with settlements and everything. My theory would be that it is mainly because we can have a division of labor and a division of activities in a much denser situation if we have this kind of separation. So we don't really need architecture for protection against the elements or against enemies or whatever. That's something that animals do as well, they build nests. But architecture starts with this kind of social separation, I would say, this social control of communication. At the same time, of course, because there was this distinction now made, sooner or later, if the theory is right, that kind of the next operation always has to connect to this kind of other side of the distinction, of course. One person will move around this thing and they will have a closer relationship again. These, are very abstract. I'll demonstrate this on a very simple example pretty soon. Because now I come to this theory that for me, architecture is an autocratic system, is alive. That means it basically only lives as long as it's used. Yeah? So this would be a great argument against conservation, because as soon as buildings are not used anymore, they're simple structures and you could take them down. That's what happened for, I think, 2,500 years. All this Denkmalschutz is a very new invention, and it has become a kind of, I think, almost sexually charged, strange thing, where people now are protecting buildings already 10 years old or something, because we are so afraid of losing anything. Certain buildings have survived thousands of years without any formal Denkmalschutz existing, but that's another thing, because as I say, so as long as they are permanently used, they would be still around. Yeah? The basis of autocratic systems is the radical temporalization of the term element due to recursive self-production. That's what I tried to explain before with life. They themselves are the product of their organization. There's no separation between producer and product. Being and doing of an autopoietic entity are inseparable, and this is their specific type of organization. So that's what a new definition of architecture could be, but now we have to find these elements that would be radically temporalized. But we have these strange objects, so it has to be objects that are operative objects, that are constantly moving. And we know that both sides, the thing is malleable and movable, and the user, of course, is movable or is automotive in a way anyways. Systems consist of momentary operations and will immediately cease to exist if they would not equip these with connectivity and therefore reproduce them. Again, this thing with connectivity we've heard before. Now comes the long-awaited, really simple example to try to illustrate this. Because I was thinking that how or where could I find examples for where this all is kind of evolving from. And the most simple thing always is games and children's games, because as you know probably from development psychology, how we learn about space, how we first learn the concept of that something that is hidden behind something is not lost, but is just behind there, is a very, very complicated thing. We take this for granted now, but children have to painfully learn this, because at the beginning, if the father, mother disappears, they are completely obsessed because they think they're dead, they're gone, they'll never come again, until they learn the objects that are kind of hidden or so can reappear again. And here we see a kind of a game that I think is fundamental for learning architectural operations or kind of an architectural system, and it's hide and seek. Unfortunately, this is a very unsuccessful example of hide and seek. It's the shortest game of hide and seek I could find.
No, see behind here. Oh, 1, 2, 3. There it comes.
Obviously failure. No? Obviously lack of architecture, lack of discrete elements, maybe too much continuity in the space, obviously. It didn't really work. We know that children with their fantasy, of course, they can do all kinds of things. They can disappear like this. And so that's something that we have to exclude now. We have to be very rational and very abstract about this game. And so I try to analyze what this game means if I'm an architect and if I draw it. So I played to certain rules that not all of you might be acquainted with. The interesting thing, these games are really global. So they exist in every culture. So it's really something almost anthropological. And the ways I set up this game is that you have obstacles, Verstecke, where the players can hide, some of them, and then you have somebody seeking for something that's globally kind of shared. But then there's also the possibility for those who are hiding to escape. And that's, I think, the interesting term in Austrian is Leo, and to run into the Leo, or Leo sign. That means if you reach the space before the seeker has seen you, you are free in a way. So both sides can win. The seeker can find children, but the hiders can also in a way win when they reach the base before the seeker reached the base. Yeah? That's also how I played it, so I hope it's a correct version. And that's not the version you know. I don't know. So we have this kind of basic elements. As I say, these are objects, discrete objects. Yeah. So we have in this case 3 obstacles. Usually it makes sense to have more obstacles than children that are hiding, because otherwise it's a bit dull. And we have a certain base that's also interesting. It's a very spatial game with very simple rules. So the first step is a certain arrangement of these obstacles. Usually children use, of course, a given environment. Yeah? But think about it, this would be a nice architectural project, and I would even give a prize for probably €1,000 that you could try to the most evolved architectural offices, and they wouldn't know how to really set up these very simple elements without even manipulating their forms to make this game in a way successful or more successful. Because the interesting thing also about hide and seek would be that there would be criteria for success, because it's so simple. You could say, if only the seeker wins, the hiders are frustrated, they don't want to play anymore. If only the hiders win, because they all can run free, they would be frustrated, the seeker would be frustrated, and they would stop as well. So you would try to look for a balance between the seeker finding, for example, 1 and 1 or 2 can run free. So this would give kind of a criteria for a successful environment. But let's start now. They all go to the center, they set up these obstacles, and in the next step, now I would say architecture starts. Yeah. Because the seeker is here, immediately there's this distinction. This object is creating a space that is available for hiding. So that's exactly this distinction and the indication of the indication of the distinction that I was talking about before. And so that's the first architectural form, because we've heard if it is to be such an autocratic system, there has to be now a sequence of these operations. Form has to connect to form to form. So the next step, logical step, is of course these other kids run around and they look for exactly this space. So they connect with their movement to this interior, as I would call it, that was provided here. And it's a very interesting and amazing thing is about the children. All know this. They count, even this kid in this game counted, yeah, and that gives a perimeter for the whole playing field, which is very intelligent, because nobody will run out there, and he knows exactly they have to be somewhere around here. So it's, as I say, it's a very clever and intelligent game. The next thing is, once these kids are hiding here, they have a certain distance to the center. That means if this seeker leaves this kind of distance circle without having seen them, given that they have equal speed, they can run free. Does that make sense? So now with this distance circle, and this area within the distance circle now gives exactly this architectural form, a distinction that this guy wants to reach. Yeah? Because if he goes in here, or goes in here, exactly only one of these points, doesn't really have to be a space, he kind of finds this kind of hidden kid, and he wins. Yeah? Next architectural form. Then he starts to move, and as it's not kind of what I would call a global observation, but a local observation that he makes, he changes the forms. Yeah? So that's very interesting, that because without changing these obstacles or moving them at all, just through his movement he changes the space. And of course then it becomes critical for these hiders, but this guy already gets into position because he reaches this distance here that is exactly as far away as he is. So if he goes further, this guy can win. Yeah? Okay, so then we have the next, does it still work? We have the next step, he moves on, doesn't find anybody here, but the next form is continuing to that, he realizes, and that's the architectural form in this case, he realizes this distance to this kind of seeker that he wanted to achieve. And then that's the final step, one of the kids has already won, but he moves on and finds the other kid, so the game is over in a way, and for me, the architecture is dead. Yeah? And that's what this thing looks like, if you look at in complexity in everything. So I think games are very interesting. They are by far not as complex as the one that Shane was designing, but I think even these very simple games, I think, give an indication of a different way maybe to think about architecture. And as I say, these are players as well, and it was interesting what you said, that you also said kind of the environment is a player. So it is, architecture is not reduced to these elements simply standing there. They have not the same mobility, they don't have the same kind of perceptive qualities as kind of this other objects running around. But of course they can be all kinds of shapes, they can be positioned in all kinds of different ways, there can be different amounts of these elements. There's a lot of variation is possible, and even calculating this in the computer becomes impossible after a certain amount of seconds, because it takes an enormous amount of time to do this. So from there, now again a step to think about, we had this situation now with this one seeker moving around. So that's just what I would say a local observation. It's one observer who kind of defines this kind of shielded area behind the obstacles. But what is if kind of some observers could come from a global situation all around this wall here? So then the maximum, as I wrote here, never mind how hard one presses oneself against a straight wall, one will be visible from more than half of the environment. So even if you're very, very slim, you can just press yourself here, then you're still visible from 180% of this environment. Which means at the same time, this is not yet an architectural form, because there's no asymmetry. There's 180 degrees here and 180 degrees here. So how can you in a way identify these areas that are kind of protected? It's by something that's called periphery circles, so that's geometry in a way. So you can make circles here, and each point of this circle has this kind of same angle of shielded area around here, and you can do this for all angles. So that's the next example. That's, for example, for 30 degrees, of course, the further away you are, the less protected you are, because now you can be seen from 330 degrees. Yes, I'm speeding up. So what helps is, of course, the deformation of an object, because suddenly an area starts to exist where these kind of periphery angles overlap, and it's more than 180 degrees. Suddenly there's an asymmetry, suddenly it makes more sense to hide here than on the other side. And that continues, of course. But it becomes even more interesting with discrete objects, because if you have two objects and they're approaching, suddenly you get this phenomenon. And it goes even further, because I did this little animation. It's not a very good animation, but still it shows what happens. And suddenly you have something with a continuous interior space, which is done by two discrete objects. And it's just based on the assumption that people are watching it from, possibly approaching it from all areas. And you will see you can even add more complexity if you have a third element. And it becomes really interesting shapes. So all these points in there are you are more successful if you hide in there than you are anywhere else in this whole area. And then, of course, you can even add it that this is moving as well, as you soon see, because I think it continues with this. Okay. So I can stop here if you want to, or I can continue with an example how to use this to analyze architecture, but I think it was too long anyway, so. 1 minute, okay, then 1 minute is probably enough. So I try, what can I do with this now, And I was thinking about the evolution of the corridor. There's an interesting dissertation by Stefan Trüby, who wrote about this, and I was even researching before that, how does this change? There was always this kind of enfilade spaces, in traditional Renaissance architecture still. You walk from room to room to room, and Alberti even said, the more doors a space has, the better. But we have ended up with these cells with one door, these captivated spaces. How did this happen? And I think it has to do with the relationship between master and servant. So in a situation where the servant is a serf, like a Leibeigner or a slave, it's an object. It's not really existing for the kind of master, so it doesn't really matter if you have this kind of arrangement, because he is not really existing. There is no need for a distance or for anything. So, as I say, this is kind of the almost Palladian model. But then happens something with kind of the continuation of modernization and individualization, that suddenly these servants become at least staff, so they are paid, they are almost considered as subjects, but not really as much as kind of the masters, so they have to keep a distance. They are allowed to come for communication, but then they have to retreat. So that means they always have to be, as soon as they finish their job, they have to retreat as far as possible. So that's a quote by Dolore. In Norway, it is very obvious that this was happening all the time. And this kind of process continues. These servants become kind of closer and closer subjects to their masters. And then when suddenly this phenomenon happens, there's lots of examples in British mansions where suddenly this kind of functional architecture evolves on the side of these kind of thoroughfare rooms. Yeah? So it is about exactly this connection between this kind of spatial behavior and this kind of spatial or architectural forms of the relationship between the people and kind of their articulation in architecture. And we know this is almost the end stage. Of course, in the beginning then, but this absurdly enough, the so-called housewives, they were replacing any kind of stuff. And we had this kind of architecture of completely functionalized corridor closed space systems, because this was not only a servicing device anymore, but it was also something meant to protect privacy and everything. The interesting thing is, of course, now, this is Mr. Moriyama that I visited some years ago, and you know the famous Moriyama house, yeah? And we try to break this up again. We have this kind of single person living somewhere, so what kind of architecture should he have? And it's this very discrete architecture, with a very really abstract system of circulation that is meant to foster then kind of accidental encounters because of this loneliness of this person that lives there. So then to finish it, I just show this kind of circulation diagrams, what this kind of evolution is doing. And that's the end, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Harald, for this super interesting talk. How you draw a conclusion from as a real socialist, from the work of Niklas Luhmann and the